Before joining INSCT, our speaker held a number of important and impressive positions. Early in his naval career, retired Vice Admiral Murrett held a variety of intelligence roles. He began as an afloat intelligence officer aboard really cool ships named things like U.S. Kitty Hawk, U.S. America, and U.S. Independence. Early assignments were assistant intelligence officer for commanders of the Second Fleet, assistant chiefs of staff for intelligence for commanders. Oh wait, I read that one. Commander of Atlantic Intelligence Command, Director of Intelligence Directorate, Office of Naval Intelligence, on and on and on. One thing I did notice was that as you went higher and higher in rank, the titles actually get shorter. Because eventually, the two highest ranking positions he held before he came here, they're just director, right? Director of Naval Intelligence and Director of the National Geospatial-Intelligence. Another thing in looking over his bio was that he has been deployed all around the globe and has had operational experience in virtually every theater imaginable. But of course, we know retired Vice Admiral Murrett as Professor Murrett. He's been Deputy Director here at INSCT since 2011. And he's also a professor of practice at the Maxwell School. He teaches quite a few of the core courses as part of our INSCT certificate programs. And I think his staff rides will now be legendary with INSCT alumni forever. So on that note, please join me in welcoming Professor Murrett.
I'll do my best to live up to that introduction. It's interesting, the assignments that Kelly mentioned and all the things that I've done. Well, I was a career intelligence officer. Most of the work I did was actually what I would describe as policy, strategy, and operations in particular, especially when I was younger. And I mention that because when people see the intelligence moniker on anybody ranging from me to a lot of other individuals that have come up in that community, in our system and in our kind of American tradition, much of that is actually about policy and I'll describe as national security decision-making more than things that are truly intelligence, particularly as you get more senior. And several people, I think, are pretty good exemplars of that. And probably in the context of today's talk, probably the best one is Bob Gates, who kind of came up through an intelligence track and spent just as much time on the National Security Council and running the National Security Council, and of course became our Secretary of Defense. Okay, this morning we have 1 hour, and I understand this classroom is going to be utilized somewhere around 1 o'clock, so I'll move along smartly. And just a confession up front, I have more slides than we have time to look at, but I'll run through them as quickly as we can. But it is a worldview and kind of projections for national and international security in the year ahead. And before I get to the specific slides, I did want to mention 3 or 4 points that are kind of themes that roll through all the slides, and they reflect changes that we have had in terms of the international security picture, which are fairly recent. That is to say, things that have just unfolded in the last 2 years, really, that are changes that have happened somewhat gradually, but I think that we're all coming to grips with today. The first one is an expansion of ungoverned and semi-governed areas, which come under different names. Some call them safe havens, some call them black spots, which some of the folks in this room work on. But we have had a significant expansion of ungoverned and semi-governed areas, really just in the last 2 years or so. And we've also had a very important shift in international policy regarding places like that, which has to do with the second key theme, which has been growing really for more than the last 2 years, maybe the last 5 years, which I describe as war weariness. The democracies of this world, including our own, but also our key allies in the NATO alliance and beyond, places like East Asia, are tired of protracted ground conflicts long distances from our shore. And it's easy to understand why, because we've been on a footing for nearly 15 years now with a fairly heavy involvement of ground forces. That has resulted in a connection between the first 2 points that I've mentioned today, these ungoverned and semi-governed areas, and the war weariness, a situation that's evolved just in the last 2 years, where there's been a subtle but very significant shift in policy by the Western democracies that we are going to tolerate pretty significant, pretty large, ungoverned and semi-governed areas. And that is a change in policy. Certainly 10 years ago, probably as recently as 5 years ago. Probably the best example of this, starting about 14 years ago, was Afghanistan, is that our stated policy was that we were not going to tolerate broad swaths of ungoverned or semi-governed areas that could be used as safe havens for planning, for mounting attacks outside of those safe havens. That has all changed now, and we are in a situation where we will have protracted shifts in geography. We can talk about the Westphalian model. The ones that are likely to last, as senior officials in our administration have said, for at least a decade. And we're going to have to deal with that. And that calls for significant changes in, among other things, homeland security, because if you're going to tolerate large black spots around the world, which we're going to have to, you have to make some changes in terms of your security posture and protection of places like Western Europe and certainly even North America. The third major point that is kind of a shift, which goes back probably at least 10 years, but is an important part of the current international security dynamic, is what I would describe as weak or sectarian partners that we need to deal with overseas. And in our typically American way, very often we just, because optimism does tend to prevail, regardless of what we say, we really do look to foreign governments, foreign partners that we may want to work with to kind of bring things together, to be able to run things inside their borders. And we just have some very, very weak partners that we've tried to work with in several places around the world, not just in the Middle East, but also Latin America, Africa, parts of South Asia, because it's not just about the Middle East. And that will present challenges for a long time as well. In all of these matters, I think there are challenges we're going to be dealing with for at least the next decade. And we will make incremental changes to all of them, but one of the things I'll talk about today is the fact that they will probably be with us for a long time. Okay, just by way of overview, this presentation is broken up into 4 sections. First, I'll talk about global security challenges. Then I'll talk about our own defense strategy, which is derived from our new national security strategy, which is just a couple months old, as many of you know. I'll talk about, being from Maxwell, I have to talk about the budget just for a little while, but I'll go over that pretty cleanly. But the resource picture and how strategy is driving the defense budget, and then I'll close with some slides on national security and strategic imperatives, try to march through this as quickly as I can in the interest of time. As some of you in the audience know, one of the things that I pay close attention to is that every December, January, usually late December, the national security apparatus, headed up by several actors in government, put together global security challenges for the year ahead, and they break these into 3 tiers. And the organization that brings all this together is the Council on Foreign Relations. And their Center for Preventative Conflict in the Council on Foreign Relations is a really good reference that I commend to all of you, and their website is pretty exceptional. One of the things they have done very, very capably, especially for the past 5 to 6 years, is put out tier 1, 2, and 3 security challenges that they see for the year ahead at the start of the new year. These have been very, very accurate, especially the tier 1 and tier 2 challenges that they have projected. The tier 3 tend to, which I won't show you today, tend to get down in the weeds. But these are the projections that they made for this coming year. And again, these were released about 4 months ago. I think you would all agree that the tier 1 and tier 2 challenges that the Council on Foreign Relations projected for this coming year are fairly accurate, fairly significant in the kind of things we're dealing with. And these are not in rank order, by the way. There's no special order within the tiers, but they are the kind of things that are probably most significant in terms of global security challenges. And I will drill down on a few of them. I'll drill down on this one, this one, this one, and this one, and also talk a little bit about disruptive transnational cyber attacks. For tier 2, I'll touch on India and Pakistan briefly, certainly the challenges that we see on East Asia, and also the swath of challenges we have extending throughout North Africa, through the Horn of Africa, into the Arabian Peninsula, which is one of the biggest challenges that we're looking at today. So again, good projections from the Council on Foreign Relations and a great resource for all of us. It also, I should mention to this audience, there is annual testimony from the Secretary of State, the Director of National Intelligence, and the Secretary of Defense before the Congress for different congressional committees, the Foreign Relations Committees, the CISI and the HIPSI, the Intelligence Committees, and also the committees that are responsible for Homeland Security. The testimony that you see, and I'll use the Director of National Intelligence as an example, pretty much corresponds to what you see here. And they have unclassified and classified sessions for all three of those, the two cabinet members and the intelligence director. But very similar to what you see here in terms of what the Council on Foreign Relations has put together. In terms of strategic challenges, one of the things that we need to be most careful about, I think, for all of us in this business, is taking a purely global approach to the challenges that we have. And I say that because it's very easy to get distracted by short suspense news events and so forth. And most of that, quite frankly, has been in the Middle East in the recent past, which has come in our own history at the expense of some very significant transnational issues that I'll talk about, but also the fact that we really do need to pay more attention to Latin America, to Africa, to South Asia, to East Asia, and some other things in the subcontinent, which have been noteworthy. I'll get to the transnational efforts, which are perhaps even more important, but I think by any objective assessment, all of us are probably guilty to some degree for the last 14 years or so of paying so much attention to this that people can't tell you where the countries are located in Africa. They've had very, very little engagement with Latin America, which is a vital strategic area for all of us, countries like Brazil, but also Argentina, Chile, and certainly Colombia. Tremendous concerns in terms of India and Pakistan and the developments that are taking place there, and significant developments in East Asia, certainly from a security standpoint, based upon the fact that the center of gravity has shifted there. So I say that up front before I turn to some events in the Middle East, because we do need to take a purely global approach to those things, and many of us in this room have been guilty of not doing that as well as we should have in the past. I also tell one story to kind of illustrate the importance of taking a global view of security challenges, and this is based on my experience on the Joint Staff, but try to make a long story short, the Indications and Warning Watch Center that we have in the United States for security matters in the Department of Defense with a lot of interagency support is a thing called the NMCC, the National Military Command Center, which has different sites, one in the Pentagon, but it's also got some outlying facilities that we can stand up in a hurry as we need to. The reason I tell the story in the context of what you see on the slide here is based on some hard lessons learned back in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. The NMCC, as you may expect, is broken up into geographic areas, and it does a really good job at the National Military Command Center, because they have a big desk and a big area on Latin America, on Africa, on all these different places, broken out into what we know as the combatant commands, which I'll show you in a second. And then they do not get distracted. They stay focused on those areas 24/7. Anytime there is a big crisis that brews up, they have to stand up a crisis watch because something has happened in one of those areas. What do they do with that special crisis watch? They move it off the watch floor. The space is configured in such a way that you have this global watch and you have outlying rooms. But if, for example, during my own tenure, the two biggest crisis events we had were possible nuclear exchanges between India and Pakistan. Because you can't afford to have a distraction for all the other people who need to have the global view in a situation like that, you take that watch, you put it in a separate room, you get it off the watch floor so they can focus at it, not disrupt people that need to pay attention to Latin America, Africa, China, Japan, and so on and so on. I think that's a good metaphor for what something that all of us need to do in terms of our own approach to global security. It just has to do with spaces and procedures that are used for indications and warning. But we, to some degree, we have collectively taken our eye off some important parts of the world for the last 14, 15 years. And I think you'll see that balance in the years ahead. Okay, turning to some current events that I think have made most of the difference in the last couple of years. I'd like to thank Martin Walls, who's in the room, for his help with many of the slides that you see this morning. One of the biggest changes that we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, a contributor to the ungoverned and semi-governed areas we've had, is the humanitarian catastrophe that has taken place in the Middle East. And it is very difficult to overstate the significance of this situation. And one kind of like gradually warming bathwater has gotten so bad that people, because it happened gradually, quite frankly, have stopped paying attention to it. This is a precursor for a lot of security-related things that I'll talk to you about in a minute. But I think it's actually the humanitarian events that have taken place in the Middle East that are most significant. 1/3 of the population of Lebanon are refugees today. The numbers that we have in Turkey, and especially Jordan, just in relative terms, because of their lower population, as you can see reflected in the slide, are pretty overwhelming, and also semi-permanent. We can have a longer discussion about how long semi-permanent means. But these are shifts in terms of borders and populations that are very, very noteworthy. They're going to be very, very difficult to roll back anytime soon. It will take years, even in the most optimistic scenario, to see how this is going to play out. There has been terrific work done by the UNHCR, Doctors Without Borders, many, many other NGOs and PBOs to deal with this. But the shifts in population and the impact, particularly upon Jordan and Lebanon, but also to a degree Turkey, until about 14 months ago, we even had refugee camps in Iraq, most of which we've had to empty out because of subsequent events. But this is the basis for most of the security challenges that we have here, and one that's going to be with us for many, many years into the future. So how to deal with that? Because of the two things that I mentioned earlier, the tolerance of some areas and also the war weariness that exists in the West, including the United States and its allies, and most of it has been in an air campaign, which has been far more significant than a lot of people realize. And has also, as we'll talk about in a second, put together coalitions that are truly interesting and have developed in ways that nobody, I don't think, would have predicted. Along those lines, a trivia question for the audience, that might win you a contest in the future. What are the only two Western nations that are conducting airstrikes in Syria today? Show of hands in the audience. Or you can't answer. Martin knows because he has his lines together for me. The two Western nations that are conducting airstrikes in Syria today. Jordan and a couple of Middle Eastern nations are, but there's only two Western nations.
Yes, okay.
United States and Canada. Who would have predicted that? The United States and Canada are the only two countries conducting strikes there. There's some other things we'll talk about in terms of details on the NATO and other coalitions that probably have significance in ways that are noteworthy. So a much larger campaign than people realize, and one that's likely to continue, but everybody realizes is not the final answer. And certainly in terms of the coalition that has operated over Iraq, notwithstanding Syria, as I mentioned, much broader than a lot of people realize, with a heavy reliance upon NATO command and control, and one that will probably not change for the future. The number of sorties, as I mentioned, I gave the aggregate total before, but you also don't want to underestimate the sheer amount of ordnance that has been dropped, and the April numbers are likely to go up. That was just through a little bit some time ago. Having said that, everyone recognizes this is not the final answer. And as we'll talk about in a minute, the challenges that we have in working with and against coalitions, and particularly working with the Iranians, with whom our interests converge in many different parts over there, not in the least. And some things that have to do with Shia and Sunni breakouts is a challenge we'll be having to grapple with for many years in the future. So what does that look like? Again, kudos to Martin Walls for putting together the slide. I think Martin is probably one of the few people in the Western world that actually understand who is doing what to whom in the Middle East. He's helped us put the slide together. But this is broken into four areas: military aid, the campaign in Syria, the campaign in Iraq, and then the people that have on-the-ground military advisors that are conducting operations to support Iraqi army, and again, this is by the government, Iraqi army forces, but also in some cases getting drawn into action. And also, interestingly, what country has had their troops in probably the biggest ground action in Iraq in the last 2 months? It's not the United States. It's Canada. Canadians were doing some advisory functions with some Iraqi ground troops. They were at a forward outpost that was in danger of being overrun. Ended up getting involved in a fairly substantial ground action. I mentioned that to you again because the actors in these events tend to be different from what you might expect. We're going to have a whole brief and a longer discussion on all of this. and how it has come together, and the ones that are actually carrying a fair amount of the weight, others that are perhaps not carrying as much. But these coalitions, just from an international diplomacy and international security standpoint, do have long-standing effects. And I would tell you, just from a purely military standpoint, the majors and the Army and Air Force captains and the petty officers and the staff sergeants from all these countries, they're all poured into the same petri dish, as they were in the Balkans in the 1990s, as they have been in Afghanistan and Iraq and other contingencies beforehand, especially in Afghanistan. And these folks all get to know each other pretty well. And when they become colonels and generals and admirals 15 years from now, it has a pretty big impact. And I think that folks always underestimate the impact of that, and the NATO alliance and otherwise. But again, from a purely military standpoint, when you put all these various nations, the up-and-coming people responsible for security and military affairs into the same petri dish for extended periods of time, it has a lot of impact. And relationships are being developed and things are playing out here that will have significance in the years ahead. At the same time, I think everybody is grappling with tough decisions that are coming forward and will come due in the next year or two. And what you see here is the Australian Prime Minister, the German Defense Minister, who's very activist, and a Canadian fire base. And these photographs were all taken within the last 2 months where? In Iraq. These photos were all taken in Iraq. Just to give you a sense of the way that people are trying to grapple with this. In fact, this is the Canadian fire base. It's named after the Canadian soldier who was killed while standing guard at the War Memorial up in Ottawa just some months ago. I think this reflects the international interest in what is happening there, and also the high regard for trying to appreciate the best way to engage forces over there and solve what everyone recognizes as a very, very difficult challenge. So, what do we do? This is pretty much where we are now. This is where we could go. And everyone, I think, in our own system, from what we call our National Command Authority and down, and our key allies and partners in the NATO alliance and beyond, who are committed to operations there, and certainly our close partners in the Middle East, are struggling with these two options. Although it should be noted, and you can read about this in the press, we have had troops on the ground from the United States in Syria on multiple occasions. Some of those that have leaked in the press, they have all been very selective, brief actions to secure populations, primarily the Yazidis, which is done by a special forces team. And I think we will always have that option available to do things that we need to for specific threats. But for an extended period of time, there is a big debate taking place. One of the, I think, best references for the difficult decisions that need to be made here was a brief but pretty comprehensive letter that General Marty Dempsey had to send to the Senate Armed Services Committee because of a marked Senate appropriations authorization bill, about a year and a half ago. And in our classes, I have our students read that pretty carefully because he walked through the options and said, these are the things that we can do which are further, and here is the likely second and third order effects that will come from it. And I think there's a much better appreciation from that in all of our leadership today, and we've seen that reflected in the tough discussions that have taken place for events in the Middle East. At the same time, as you all know, we have some real challenges dealing with Russia based on events that have already taken place in Georgia, but more recently in the Crimea and the Ukraine. Again, a protracted situation that is not likely to get wrapped up very soon. We've seen some significant things in terms of the Russian leadership's fairly forward-leaning posture and the nervousness that is created in what I describe as unsafe NATO as opposed to safe NATO. One of the other important things that we've seen in terms of Russian activity is the emergence of hybrid war, which the Russians have pretty much mastered as a technique, really just in the last, again, 2 years, and done so fairly slowly, but in ways that have crept up on people. They've been very, very effective at hybrid war. Certainly in the Crimea, where what they did there was wrong, and I don't support it for a second, but from a purely, to evaluate it on a neutral standpoint, you have to say it was very, very effective as an operation. And it was comprised of all the things you can see here in this definition for the economists on hybrid war. Something we're likely to see a lot more of from Russia in the future. At the same time, the absolute numbers are less daunting, but certainly the relative numbers in terms of defense spending between Russia and the European NATO partners is troubling. You may see that change in a bit, but there's no question that the resurgence of Russia, notwithstanding oil prices, is a big challenge. So what should we do? This is where we are. Certainly the first three. Policy isolation, as you know, we no longer have a G8, we now have a G7, which is pretty telling. The economic measures, which are pretty significant, and very high level of support from Western Europe on that, more than a lot of us would have expected. Dealing with the NATO alliance and concerns in places like the Baltic states and elsewhere about future steps, and then an ongoing debate throughout the West of how much of a constructive relationship you can really have with Vladimir Putin. I talked to a lot of senior people, including Bob Gates, who believes very strongly you cannot have a constructive relationship with Putin. Interestingly, he thinks you could have with Medvedev, and Medvedev is a person you could deal with and actually make progress. He does not feel the same way about Putin. So at the same time, weighing that, there are some things we have to do with Russia, and we do have to engage them certainly on nuclear issues, which is perhaps more important, as I'll talk about in a second. Just as a case study, the recent disposal of chemical weapons in Syria, which was a U.S.-Russian cooperative effort, was very successful. And probably a really good case study on how two countries who disagree on some other things can actually do a lot of good. And the teams have been working these issues for about 25 years. And I wasn't surprised to see them do it so well. We still need the NDN, this is called the Northern Distribution Network, because we cannot withdraw or get supplies in and out of Afghanistan all through Pakistan. It's just too hazardous. We have to go through Russia to do that. And just another vignette, some people in the room know this, but all of our space engines for heavy lift come from Russia, the RD-80s. They manufacture. We do not have capacity in the United States for heavy lift engines, even though the Air Force may try to change that. It's going to take them about 5 years. But they are all of Russian manufactured. There's no way we can change that anytime soon. So the right balance there is very difficult, and one we'll have to deal with for the course of the future. Okay, at the same time that is taking place, we are transitioning from Afghanistan. I won't spend too much time on that. It is interesting that the partners, the heads of state that we have in both Afghanistan and Iraq are certainly stronger and better to deal with than their predecessors. They're not perfect people, but they are an improvement. And I think, and as you know, when the Afghanistan premier was in the United States just about 3 weeks ago, President Obama agreed to leave slightly more forces in Afghanistan for a slightly longer period of time. We're just talking 10,000. It's not a very high number compared to what we used to have. But that has been promising. The other big issue for Afghanistan, which Stan McChrystal used to stay all the time, and I think he was right, is relative to Afghanistan and the withdrawal, the question you really have to ask yourself is, yes, Afghanistan, but where do you want to be in the region? Because Afghanistan borders many other countries that we have strong strategic interest in. So I think for the NATO alliance, the West, and the United States, probably the biggest question for Afghanistan is where we need to be in the region. And also to look after Afghanistan as well as we can, to try to bring them into the, I was going to say 21st century, try to bring them into the 20th century, for those of you that have been over there, but also where we need to be in the region. That's something that we'll be debating for many years in the future. One of the best parts that has come out of our engagement with Afghanistan and so many other places has been our role with the alliance. We had a much longer discussion in terms of our partnership with the NATO nations, but also the other ones. I would only say that NATO is probably more important now than ever, in spite of our frustration with things like the level of defense spending that we see in Europe and elsewhere, but also the whole diplomatic and political side of the NATO alliance. And you can make a case that the most important things that NATO does is actually the political side of NATO, the North Atlantic Council, the ambassadors from all the countries that are parts of the NATO alliance, but also the Mediterranean Dialogue countries, the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative countries, the Partnership for Peace countries, all of them represented there at the NATO political headquarters in Brussels as opposed to the military headquarters in Mons. But the value of NATO because of its political alliance and also the leadership. Anders Fogh Rasmussen of Denmark just wrapped up an extended tour as the NATO Secretary General, and I think by any objective standard, diplomats around the world will tell you he was a very, very effective Secretary General on the political side of NATO. Leave alone all the military operations and the important things they do in terms of the military leadership and their coalitions. On that side, relative to military operations and the uniform side and the leadership of the NATO alliance, it's probably more important there than ever, too, just because of, we won't have time to talk about this today, the complexity of 21st century command and control. You cannot do air, sea, land campaigns, as we have seen so many places, without very, very sophisticated, in-place command and control, and also having exercised that command and control in peacetime exercises. And the only worldwide alliance that does that over and over again is NATO. For example, all those air operations that I showed you in Iraq and Syria were all out of a place called the CFAC, which is in the Middle East. And it's essentially a NATO facility and uses NATO, what are called TTPs, Tactics, Techniques, and Procedures, part of NATO ATPs, which are Allied Tactical Publications. All the transistors that are connected to do the incredibly complex command and control and 24/7 operations around the clock and airspace and ground space deconfliction are all NATO procedures. And they are used for virtually any coalition operation that takes part in the world today, which is virtually all the operations that we do. And we can't understate the importance of that, in spite of the frustrations that many people have with the alliance. Another time that even though it was not technically a NATO operation, the NATO procedures were used completely, was a successful operation in relative terms, Operation United Assistance in response to the Ebola outbreak in Africa last year. Very much a precursor for things that we're likely to see in the future, and one that if you look at the projections that we had for what was likely to take place for additional lethal infections for the people that had contracted Ebola, which were going to extend well into this year in numbers 7 or 8 or 10 times what you see here, was pretty successful and staunching what could have been an even larger catastrophe than it was already. A lot of us saw prior evidence of this during the H1N1 outbreak, which took place about 5.5 years ago now. We're likely to see this again, and it's something that we need to be conscious of from a security standpoint because it will stress security-related personnel, and also certainly the civilian and medical apparatus pretty effective. Okay, before we shift gears to strategy, my scariest slide that I show everybody. I talked earlier about, just from a geographic standpoint, how we have kind of taken our eye off the ball of some parts of the world for the last 14 years. Probably the biggest transnational issue that we are guilty of not paying nearly as much attention to as we should have. And the biggest strategic threat that we have in the world today and have had for many years is nuclear weapons. As Craig Fields, who's a senior member of the Defense Science Board, used to remind me all the time, he says, if one of these weapons goes off, nobody's going to remember anything else for a long time in terms of the security of the community. And the Defense Science Board also made a prediction about a year ago that there was at least a 50-50 chance of having some kind of an explosion of one of these nuclear weapons, which number 16,300, count them again, 16,300, sometime in the next 5 years. And if and when that happens, it, I think will probably put in context all the other things we've been dealing with for probably the last couple of decades. I would also mention that people will look at after this carefully. People, by the way, like Ash Carter from the Belfer Center at Harvard, say the most likely nuclear explosion that we would have in the next near future, say the next 3 to 4 years, would be an unintentional explosion from part of the Russian decaying military stockpile just because of sloppiness, inattention, or lack of resources. It's not likely to be terrorists getting a French nuclear weapon and setting it off in Riviera or something. There's not nearly as much concern by people who are experts on this in the national labs and so forth, as there is, quite frankly, just lack of attention. The cost associated with maintaining very old nuclear weapons, especially in Russia. And in fact, they also predict that the kind of explosion which would take place would likely be low order and not high order, because it would just be an accident or a security breach and not anything deliberate. Having said that, nuclear weapons do represent an existential threat, particularly EMP, high-altitude explosions of any nuclear weapons. It's unlikely for that to happen because there's no nation in the world that would like to execute such an option to give us a nuclear winter. But this is our biggest security challenge, and one that we have not paid much attention to for about 14 years now. And we need to remind ourselves of that and probably redouble our efforts to dismantle as many of these weapons as possible and get them down to numbers where you can be more comfortable with them. Okay, shifting gears now. Challenges in the year ahead and strategic guidance. I'll walk through this quickly so we'll have some time for Q&A. We do have a national security strategy. It's brand new. Just came out in February, fairly recently. I mention that because it's actually a very worthwhile document, and you can read the President's introduction, which is only 2 pages, and the overview, which is only 5 pages, in about 10 or 15 minutes. It ought to be mandatory reading for everybody. Just a couple of groups that I'll give you on the national security strategy. It focuses on 4 primary thrusts: security, prosperity, values, and the importance of international order. It talks about, you'll see this in the next slide. I got 2 slides on it, don't worry. Leading with purpose, strength, example, capable partners, interagency, all the instruments of U.S. power, and taking a long-term perspective. In the President's introductory letter, he states that we are stronger, better positioned with growing economic strength. Getting back to prosperity here. Resilient and diversified economy, and possess a military as might, technology, and geostrategic reach is unrivaled in human history. It is probably the most, and we've had national security strategies, typically 2 from all the 2-term administrations and 1 from the 4-year presidencies we've had. This is probably the most upbeat, positive, and optimistic national security strategy we've ever had. And I think it surprises a lot of people when they read it, because there's a lot of hand-wringing taking place today, and a lot of angst about world events. But particularly the President's letter of introduction to this NSS, but also the themes that go right throughout it, dealing with matters like education, health, the economy. But it's kind of reflected in this quote that you see here. It is remarkably upbeat, remarkably positive. It paints a pretty good picture for the future, which some people may say is too optimistic, but nonetheless is very real. Just 5 points that I would make to take away from our new national security strategy and how it will play out over time. It does take a very broad view of national security, which is consistent with themes you've seen from this administration in their first national security strategy document that came out about 5 years ago. Climate change, energy markets, infectious disease. Education is reinforced over and over again. The concept of strategic patience. Now, some people have interpreted strategic patience as lack of more aggressive action to security threats, but it's a concept that runs through the entire document. This fact that we're going to have to, it's going to take time to deal with some things. And the President says in his introductory letter, not once but twice, these are all challenges that are going to extend well into the next administration, whoever our next president is. He or she's going to have to deal with them as well. Very strong language on NATO, which is appropriate, certainly given all the alliances done and continues to do. This is, and I would never dream of teaching political philosophy, but consistent with their previous NSS and something that would keep Henry Kissinger awake at night, it probably does. This political philosophy theme that runs through the entire document, which you hear this administration, this idea that our values cannot be separated from our interests, which is very different in character from the political approach it seems from many other national security seniors. Specifically, people like Kissinger believe that you just have to look after your strategic interest. Whereas President Obama's been pretty consistent since day one, that our values are our interests, and our interests are our values, and you can't separate them, which is, again, something I'll turn over to the political scientists. A final point, it does make, you get beyond the introduction, although it's still a very concise document, make reference to things they have done during their tenure in the executive, and tries to bring them forward as things related to the future. Some people have interpreted that as kind of explaining and, to some degree, trying to justify things they have done already, but nonetheless, it is significant. I think we'll take some time for questions and answers, but just quickly, I'll go through a couple of slides. This was used as the basis for our defense strategy, which I won't get into detail on, but it has had a direct impact on this document, which has been updated by some things you've seen since then, and I'll just march through the slides. The overall defense strategy that we have in terms of military and balancing global strategic risk. I'll show a slide on later on, some specifics here. And also a thing called the Strategic Choices and Management Review, which was a strategy review which was tasked by Secretary Hagel in response to the Budget Control Act. And some things related to sequestration in terms of shifting strategy to correspond to resources. Another recent thing that happened last year called the Quadrennial Defense Review, which had a defense strategy section in it. Notwithstanding, it did not change significantly the defense strategy that you saw, which was rolled out by the President 4 years ago. And also some current guidance, which you saw referenced by the Secretary of Defense when he was here just a few years ago, who is focused on all of those documents which correspond to the national security strategy, but also 3 key areas: making and implementing the best possible national security decisions. That was the first of the 3 points that he says he plans to stress. Why do we think he said that? What would cause this new Secretary of Defense to emphasize the fact that he wants to be a key player from a Defense Department standpoint in making and implementing the best possible national security decisions? Why do we think he did that? I'll give you a hint, it has to do with the White House and his predecessor. This is an inside fastball at Susan Rice. Essentially, what he's saying here is that the Defense Department will provide the most frank advice directly to the President. And his predecessor, Chuck Hagel, was marginalized, quite frankly, from a lot of the Defense Department decisions. And he has made it clear in this statement, but also the statements he made when he was nominated and upon being sworn in as Secretary of Defense, that he expects to be a key player in those decisions, and that he will give his frank advice to the President, and also certainly the history that he's had as Deputy Secretary of Defense and other posts. I think we'll see that again. Looking after the people element is essential, which he talked about here down in this building a few weeks ago. Personnel as being most important, and also looking to the future and being a better steward of resources for the United States. Okay, with that, let's go to a final slide here. I won't go through the resources picture. The only point I'll make on this is that for those of us who are involved in budget and resource matters, we probably need to at least have some appreciation of how we have gotten to where we are since the Budget Control Act, which resulted in sequestration, was passed in August 2011. Because there have been some very important waypoints in terms of our resources related to national security and the Defense Department, but also the Department of Homeland Security, the State Department, and the intelligence community that have played out through all these fairly significant actions since 2011, when the Budget Control Act was passed. It has also resulted in more disruption relative to the budget and an inability to do long-term planning for the national security apparatus, which is probably more severe than any time in the last 20 or 30 years. With one small blip during the Clinton administration, we had a government shutdown then as well. From a governance standpoint, not terribly encouraging, really challenging. I think the Defense Department and others have done as well as they could to deal with it, but big challenges and ones that we hope get remedied so we can do some more deliberate long-term planning for resources in the future. Okay, we'll go into detail on where we are with that. Okay, I've tried to talk to you today about challenges for this year and beyond. I've taken a strategic view in terms of balancing engagement, balancing long-term global strategic risk, and also taken a worldwide view on some of the truly strategic challenges that we have to deal with in the year ahead. And with that, I'll turn it over to you for your questions and comments. Charles, you go first.
Sure. I know even a year and a half ago, we talked a lot about this kind of rebalancing to Asia and things like that. And with Crimea coming up and Russia's posturing and things of that nature, how does that affect the budgeting process when folks are looking to appropriate more funds in the years to come?
Yeah, great question. First, I would say it's more likely to affect countries in Western Europe than it is to affect us directly, because while Russia is a very significant part of our overall strategic picture, it's not quite as immediate as it is for countries like Poland and the Baltic states, even Norway. Sweden, I saw just last week, is going to substantially up their defense spending in response to what Russia is doing. So I think there'll be more immediate impact on countries neighboring Russia. I think another important point, Charles, is that in terms of defense spending and defense resources from a global perspective, we have continued to see, and I think because of Russian behavior, we'll see a little bit of a slight slowing of what has been an important shift of military capabilities, especially general purpose force military capabilities from Western Europe to the Far East. But, and particularly for air and naval forces. But one of the things you've seen for the past 20 years in particular is that in terms of capability, the high-end air and naval forces that existed before that in Western Europe have pretty much been dismantled. I mean, countries like Spain, many others have pretty much done away, especially with the naval, but also their air forces. At the same time, Japan, South Korea, Australia, certainly China are growing in leaps and bounds in terms of professional capability for all types of military forces, but particularly air and naval forces. Japan probably has certainly the second or third most professional and capable Navy in the world today. And countries in Western Europe that used to have fairly robust forces along those lines have, to a large degree, dismantled them. So I think what you're seeing in terms of the Russian behavior will cause a slight slowing in some of the downturn that we've seen in Western Europe, but we'll have to see how long that remains. We don't know yet. Okay, other questions? Yeah.
So, kind of going back to what you were just talking about with Russia and Ukraine, how much do you think that the level of the U.S. response is a result of us needing to use that route through Russia to get to Afghanistan, and the space shuttles, they're the ones with the heavy equipment?
Yeah.
So, do you think if those things weren't the case, would we have a stronger response?
Probably not. The U.S., but I need to give you a broader answer. That's a great question, Kara, because I think it's a whole Western European answer to that too, which is perhaps more telling. We tend to not be too terribly affected by it. I think the United States and Secretary Kerry and our diplomatic posture for dealing with Russia and issues like that, the United States doesn't respond well to those kinds of things which can correspond to threats, and that continues to surprise people, and probably shouldn't. I think, and you have to understand this, Western European countries like Poland, like Germany, like Austria, like the Czech Republic, like Slovakia, you have to understand they have a slightly different perspective on this, to some degree because of energy supplies from Russia, but also just the good of their economy, and I don't think it can be blind to that. But I think, for example, if Vladimir Putin came out today and said, if you don't stop doing exercises in Poland and the Baltic states, providing lethal military assistance to Kiev, the government of the Ukraine, or we will shut down the northern route in Afghanistan and we'll stop giving you RD-80 engines, I don't think we change anything. think we respond well to those kinds of approaches. Now, but again, having said that, I think we do need to be sensitive to some of the dependencies that Eastern, Western Europe has on Russia, and take that into account in terms of our agreements. Well, as I said earlier, the Western European countries for the sanctions have been taking a stronger posture than a lot of us expected. Okay, other questions?
One question.
Yes, Kelly.
So you mentioned at the beginning that when you're talking about the three trends you see, and you're talking about perhaps you might, find ourselves in a position where we're more tolerant of ungoverned or weakly governed. And then you just have this little line in there about how this is going to impact homeland security possibility. And I was thinking about how Secretary Carter was saying that he recently advocated for the DHS budget. It makes me a little nervous here. So can you expand on that?
Sure, a great question. And one that if we had more time we could expand on. And let me use this slide to address it. These are some areas that we have to be very concerned about. And in fact, because it's a little bit dated, the one in Libya is actually a lot bigger. The one in Yemen is bigger. This one is actually extended north. But these are ungoverned and semi-governed areas just in this part of the world. There are others in some other sections, the tri-border area in Latin America, and, as reflected there, parts of Indonesia, but also to some degree Mindanao in the Philippines. The logic is that if you accept that these are going to kind of stay as ungoverned, semi-governed areas, or another broader discussion, terrorist safe havens, and that they are going to be capable of mounting attacks outside of these safe havens, which has already happened with ISIL or ISIS or Daesh, another discussion on what you want to call them. They have mounted attacks outside of their the geography that they control in Syria and Iraq. One of the logical responses that you've already seen in Western Europe in particular, not so much in North America, is to have more homeland security, better airport security, better border controls, customs and immigration, to keep people that are in these places out of, say, France from being able to mount attacks in France because of capabilities, training, or equipment, gear that they've been able to bring from these black spots, whatever you care to call them, to mount attacks in populated area against innocent civilians. And you probably need to put that in categories too, because you have the people that come from there and use it to mount attacks. We also have the like-mindeds, as we saw in Paris and Ottawa and Australia and a lot of other locations recently. So I think that's the big issue. And it does call for us to kind of recalibrate, because insofar as our policy was until a few years ago, that we're going to shrink all of these and we're not going to allow any pockets like this to exist on the globe. Now we are. We're going to probably tolerate them for a long period of time in the future. We're going to try to shrink them, contain them, counter the people that are our adversaries that live within them, but we're not going to be able to take them off the map, and probably not for many years. I think that leads you to more homeland security, especially in Western Europe. Yes.
You talked a little bit about Latin America and how we might need to pay a little bit more attention to it. I was wondering if you could talk specifically about Brazil and what sort of challenges you see with respect to them, and also maybe opportunities as well.
Great question. Brazil is a country that we absolutely need to pay more attention to, just based on economic, population, ecological issues. I think the primary task that we have with Brazil is trying to be more positive in terms of our engagement with their population, not just from a security standpoint, but security defined more broadly in terms of some of the things we talked about in our own NSS, to include partnering more closely with Brazil on matters such as the environment, education, and probably population-related matters, and not in the least the importance of the rainforest and climate change as it applies to Brazil. I think they're probably one of the most important countries for us. You know, when you, it's sad when you, I do make it a point to reread Franklin Delano Roosevelt's speeches pretty regularly, and he always talks about the unity of the Americas, and how important it is for the Americas to work with each other, which is something that's been almost completely absent from our dialogue about the last 15 years or so. I just really think we've taken our ball off Latin America, with the possible exception of Colombia, where we've been engaged and fairly successful. But, you know, first world countries like Chile, developments in places like Bolivia, trying to bring Argentina along as well as we can, and most importantly, Brazil, which is having huge impact. As you may know, diplomatically, the biggest challenge we've had with Brazil has been what? Stone revelations. I think we'll get over that eventually, but that was a big setback.
Has there been any discussion of trying to bring Brazil on board into some sort of global alliance? Because it's very strong economically, and also their politics. They're strong social democracy. So it seems like a lot of their politics align with our values as well.
A lot of parallels with India. I think Brazil and India as the non-aligned countries. A broader discussion and a great question about, you know, who ought to be in what is now the G7. And you know, the G12 and the G16 and who's in and who's not in. There is a certain amount of legacy there. I mean, you can make a stronger case for Brazil, certainly, than some of the people that are currently in the G7. But, you know, it has it's not as nimble as it ought to be. But Brazil definitely needs to take a role among the first order countries of the globe for a lot of reasons. And I think we'll see that happening in the future. We ought to do that as part of the Americans, which is something we haven't paid enough attention to. Yeah.
I'm sorry that I walked in late, so perhaps you covered this, but I'm curious, with all these new threats, have you been able to articulate or see anyone who has successfully articulated a grand strategy for America, one that really sets the tone for the next few generations, like we had with containment, or we had with the Monroe Doctrine, things of that nature?
There have been many discussions along those lines, and Chris is, you may have not, we did look at our own national security strategy, which I would not equate to a grand strategy to compare to some of the things you see in the 18th or 19th century. But among the grand strategies that are being rolled out now are things like the cost-imposing strategies. There's a lot of discussion about that in Western circles. Others that have to do with long-term sustainment, taking in a broader array of effects, which are reflected in the NSS. And also the coming to grips with some of the roots of the international security challenges that we're seeing, which would probably have to be part of a grand strategy. I think that on the rheostat of how grand it is, our own national security strategy it's not a truly grand strategy, but it's pretty close, and probably under the circumstances as good as you could have at this point. The real litmus test, I think, will be what our next president, our next administration, whoever he or she is, does with that and how they take it into the future. It's a great question. It also has to be very responsive, and I think grand strategies in the past have been just that. Okay, I think we have to vacate the classroom now, if I'm not mistaken. Thanks for your attention. It's been good to see you here today.